Hey everybody, I'm JC from One Shot Adventures, and today I'm going to review one of the newest Dungeon Crawl Classics adventures, Danger in the Air. And I'll give you some tips and tricks on how to run it like a pro. Now, those of you who have seen my channel before know that I'm a big fan of Dungeon Crawl Classics. It's one of my favorite old school Dungeons and Dragons-like games. While I don't really have problems with 5th edition, it's fun and I've played it a lot, I prefer games like Dungeon Crawl Classics because it's a more dangerous and surprising game. It often subverts standard fantasy tropes, and it has just a fantastic collection of adventures that range from sword and sorcery to fantasy horror to just really weird and gonzo. Well, today I'm going to talk about one of those weird and gonzo adventures. Danger in the Air is a very short adventure which takes the heroes far up into the sky to explore the insides of a massive, floating, blimpy creature that's drifting over their village. Now, Danger in the Air is what Dungeon Crawl Classics calls a funnel adventure, which means that it's designed for players to take about 4 zero-level characters into it. Inevitably, most of those characters are going to meet horrible fates. When I ran this adventure, I had PCs frozen, dissolved, crushed, and killed in lots of other creative ways, which I'm going to tell you about in just a few minutes. But first, I want to warn you that there are spoilers coming up ahead, so if you're thinking about playing in this adventure, just turn right around and climb back down this weird, blimpy creature in the sky and tell your game master to check this out instead. Alright, so strap on your pot helms, here we go. Danger in the Air is written by Michael Curtis, one of the veteran authors of the Dungeon Crawl Classics line. It's a pretty short adventure overall. It was given away for free on Free RPG Day, so the entire adventure fits into less than 10 pages, which means that it can easily be prepped and run in a single session. In fact, when I ran it, my players and I finished this entire adventure in about 2.5 hours, which means that I think it's a perfect adventure for when you and your friends just don't have a lot of time, or if you want to give your group a little taste of Dungeon Crawl Classics. The adventure starts out when the PCs wake up one morning, and what do they see far above the sky in their village? This massive, bizarre-looking inert creature just floating over their town. This thing is like a monstrous dead Pokemon, but better than that, it's leaking treasure out. As the thing floats overhead, farmers are mysteriously finding gold and electrum coins in their fields. So clearly, there's treasure inside this thing. But there's a hitch because the winds will inevitably blow the strange blimp away from the village and to who knows where. So time's running out for anybody who wants to go inside and explore it. So the PCs are the brave, or more likely pretty stupid, villagers who climb up this creature's dangling tentacles and gain entry into its body to hunt for treasure. This is actually a pretty cool and wild opening for an adventure, especially a first level adventure, I think. Now, within minutes of climbing up into this creature's body, your players are going to soon realize that they're actually exploring a strange, organic spaceship, a vessel that was mysteriously mortally wounded as it entered the PC's world. All of the rooms inside this creature are organic, filled with alien flora everywhere, and they all use these defense systems made out of unusual materials like sponges. Like I said at the top, this adventure is very short, so there's only 3 levels to this vessel, each with only a few rooms. I won't go into detail into each of the rooms, because there's just not many of them, and really there's only 2 different types of rooms. The first are the rooms that still have the ship's defense systems working in them. These are essentially action-packed trap rooms where players must deal with some kind of weird and mysterious danger or device to survive the room. These rooms almost have the feel of that old Dragon's Lair arcade game where you walk into a room, wonder what the heck is going on with a lot of moving parts, and then you have about 30 seconds to figure it all out before something kills you. So for example, in one room, there's these roly-poly metal balls that are just zipping around the room. And just as you start to figure out what their purpose is, they suddenly pop up these little laser weapons and start blasting the heroes with these lavender energy beams. Another one of my favorite rooms is filled with an array of weird rainbow-colored clouds. They seem harmless, but if interfered with in just the right way, they'll suddenly kill the PCs in a dozen different ways. For example, when I ran this, I had one player who just walked into the room and was delighted by all of these rainbow pretty clouds, and he thought they were all really beautiful, and then he just started messing with them, and he immediately was frozen solid, fell to the ground, and shattered.
Oh guys, they're so pretty!
It's true. Death comes pretty easy in some of these rooms, and I will admit sometimes it feels kind of random, but that's why Dungeon Crawl Classics gives you 4 characters per player to play through one of these funnel adventures with. So I wouldn't run this where every player is controlling just one character because it'll be a total party kill probably within the first half hour. But with 4 different characters, it's kind of fun to experiment and see what happens to all of your guys. The second type of rooms are the ones filled with a variety of gadgets from the ship's prime. For example, there's one room that has tables and tables filled with artifacts, gadgets, and other exotic gear. Some of these items are dangerous, but others can act as really useful weapons or healing items or tools to overcome some of the other room's challenges. Now, if there's one problem with this adventure, it's that there's not a lot of good incentive for your players to play around with any of these cool items. When I ran this game, by the time my players started discovering these rooms with the gadgets in them, they were so terrified of everything on this ship that they just started treating the entire place like a museum. They just left all of the gadgets alone. They were just too afraid of random death at this point to mess around with any of them. Part of the reason that there's this problem in Death in the Air is that all of the items on this vessel are really weird, so it's hard to get a sense of what they might actually do until your player just decides to fiddle with it. In a fantasy game, you don't have as much of this problem straight out because things are more recognizable. It's easier for your players to judge risks when they see an item of a certain type. You know, like if you walk into a dungeon room and you see a potion, well, you know you have to drink it to activate it, and you have some sense of the good things that can happen when you drink it and the bad things that can happen. There's not really a mystery of how you use a potion. But in Death in the Air, you find these wacky items that are just really to tell what on earth they might do or how to even use them. For example, in one room, you find these syrup-filled bubbles. They're actually grenades, and they're super useful to overcome some of the enemies later on in the adventure, but it's just as likely that one of your players is going to pick one up and squeeze it into their mouth.
What? I'm thirsty.
In another room, players find these baggy suits filled with damp moss. Now, it turns out these are actually protective spacesuits, and they're also really helpful for dodging some of the security measures later on in the vessel. But for a player to make the leap of logic to climb into a suit filled with icky, damp moss on a spaceship already filled with tons of deadly mechanisms, well, you just need to be a special kind of player to want to do that. I don't know, maybe my players were just conservative and you'll get different results here. Now, one way you can help address this problem without making it too easy on your players, I definitely don't want to help you do that, but you can give your players an opportunity to see some of these items in use before they get a chance to experiment with them. For example, if you found a dead alien wearing one of those spongy spacesuits, it might make your players a little bit more incentivized to go ahead and try one on because they'll have kind of an idea of what they do, but it'll still seem pretty dangerous because, after all, this poor guy wearing it is just like a burned skeleton. Or something else that I did is with those roly-poly security drones, I actually had one of them spit out one of those explosive syrup balls at the players. This disintegrated a player, but it did then give the players some idea of what those things were for. And so when they came across a stash later, they were still pretty terrified of them, but they were incentivized enough to stick a couple in their bag, and that turned out to help them later on. So basically what I'm telling you is just give your players some extra hints on what these items might do. Otherwise your players might turn out like mine and willfully ignore all this cool gear in the adventure, and that's kind of a shame because there is a lot of creativity and fun stuff written into these rooms. Eventually, the players will make their way up to the very top of the ship where they'll find the Conscious Personality Unit, or CPU, which is guarding entry into the ship's bridge. Now this creature is sort of an AI made out of liquid metal that can constantly reform, and it's a really fun scene because the PCs get a chance to talk to this computer before it eventually goes haywire and attacks them. This is like a really fun boss battle, especially if the PCs have picked up some of those weird items on the ship that they don't really know how they work. Although I said that my players mostly didn't touch anything on the ship, they did pick up some of those weird syrup balls, the ones that burst into acid and exploded when thrown. So they started chucking these eggs at the CPU, and it was a total mess. They fumbled the rolls a lot, and one of the heroes just hit the wall, which burned a hole into the hull of the ship. So then this was perfect because the evil CPU could use its liquid metal tentacles to start picking up heroes and tossing them outside the ship, and the heroes would fall to their deaths below. Yeah, the big finale to this adventure is just weird and scary and fun and chaotic, and it really just makes for a great ending to a gonzo Dungeon Crawl Classics adventure. Once the malfunctioning CPU is defeated, the players gain entry to the bridge, where they find the poor dead pilot of the ship, this beautiful blue-skinned elf who died of decompression as her ship entered the atmosphere. It's actually kind of sad, and my players felt really bad for this poor captain of the ship. But on the other hand, they find on her body a key to the treasure vault on the ship, where they'll find enough treasure to make them formidable level 1 characters. By the way, I need to point out that there's a really big typo on the map here. It mixes up the bridge and the treasure room with the same number, so just fix this with a pencil before you GM this one, or else you could really mess up the ending here. It's not a big deal if you know about it, but it's a shame to see such an obvious mistake introduced in this adventure like this. You can probably tell that overall, I really like this adventure. I found it to be just a ton of fun to run and watch my players react in surprise with everything in it. I like that there's almost nothing ordinary about this adventure. Everything in it is all weird and exotic and ethereal, and it really captures the spirit of what Dungeon Crawl Classics goes for. It surprises the players constantly with lethal dangers, weirdness, and mysteries that aren't fully explained. And because the whole thing is really short, that alien science fiction feeling doesn't overstay its welcome. So to me, this makes Death in the Air a great choice to play with a group of players looking to give Dungeon Crawl Classics a try. Now I want to talk a little bit more about how this adventure mashes up science fiction and fantasy. I mostly want to compliment the adventure on dodging most of the problems with those kinds of genre mix-ups. While mixing science fiction and fantasy has been done before in RPGs, like the classic Expedition to the Barrier Peaks did it like over 30 years ago, this is still a really hard thing to do well. And I think that's because that while fantasy has a lot of traditional tropes that most players just automatically understand, science fiction is just a really open-ended genre that usually requires way more explanation for players to grok what's going on in this world. It can be a lot to ask your players to figure out all the rules of your science fiction world, especially one that they've never visited before in movies or books or TV shows they like. So when multiple genres, including science fiction, are mashed together haphazardly, you can end up with something that's just really confusing to players. But this mashup works really well in Death in the Air because it clearly spells out what every room does. It keeps most of the explanations for how things work behind a curtain, and it spends like zero time trying to explain a galactic history or who these people were. It just skips over all of that and just leaves it all kind of mysterious. It just does a good job at lightly touching on the science fiction, and by the time your players start asking questions or maybe getting confused, the entire adventure's over because it can be run in just 2 hours. Just nothing outstays its welcome here. But all that said, some players just won't be into these kinds of genre mashups. Some players are drawn to Dungeon Crawl Classics because they prefer more of a sword and sorcery feel, with their heroes battling dark gods and cutting down evil cultists. Those types of players may not appreciate Death in the Air's kind of wacky science fiction tone, assortment of unknowable puzzle items, and lack of clear bad guys. Some players just want to chop the heads off of cultists, right? But I think you'll know if those players are your players. Finally, I'll point out that because this is a funnel adventure, if you run Death in the Air, you're making a conscious choice to kick off your entire campaign with a gonzo science fiction fantasy mashup, which might not feel right if you then follow up this adventure with something more typical. But hey, this is Dungeon Crawl Classic, so there's actually more adventures that follow in this spirit. For example, you could follow this up with Frozen in Time, which is a science fiction fantasy mashup that actually has a very similar feel to this one. It could be awesome for GMs looking to embrace a very different feel for their campaign. So in the end, I say check this adventure out if you're looking for something weird and wildly different from other fantasy adventures, and you don't have a lot of time to prep or run something for your players. Well, I hope this video was helpful to any game master looking to run Death in the Air. If you ran this or played in this adventure, I'd love to hear how it went for you. Go ahead and leave me a note in the comments below. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe my channel if you want to see more reviews like this one. Until next time, I'm JC, and just remember, if you ever find yourself floating in a weird alien museum, look all you want, but don't touch.